The studio pulsed with restless anticipation as the late show kicked into gear. Stephen Colbert strode onto the set, his grin sharp, and rehearsed waving to the crowd before settling behind his desk. The audience roared as Elon Musk followed his lanky frame, cutting through the spotlight with a quiet intensity, his eyes sweeping the room, assessing it like a battlefield. The lights bore down, amplifying the weight of what promised to be a volatile night. Few could have predicted that Stephen would end up ejecting Elon from the stage, but the fault lines were already forming. Stephen launched with a playful dig, ribbing Elon's knack for world-shaking ideas a tesh, then zeroed in on the night's real fuel. Elon's latest climate gambit, the tech titan, had unveiled a plan to unleash solar-powered drones seeding the atmosphere with reflective particles to cool the planet fast, a geoengineering Hail Mary that had the world divided. Stephen Unk's brows arched. He tore into it with gusto, questioning whether this was brilliance or just another rich man's ego trip. Was Elon out to save the Earth, or was he rolling the dice with it? Elon leaned back, cool at first, laying out the logic. Science, he said, could rewind decades of warming in a fraction of the time. His voice was crisp, grounded in data, but laced with a tension that clashed with Stephen's doubt. The host fired back, conjuring images of skies dulled by artificial fog, nature buckling under a plan no one fully understood. What made Elon think he could rewrite the planet? Who would answer for the fallout if it failed? The crowd shifted, some egging Stephen on, others grumbling. In Elon's corner, the back and forth sharpened as Stephen leaned harder into the ethics, accusing Elon of bypassing the messy reality of global agreement. His hands slashed the air, his voice climbing, demanding to know if the world had volunteered for this, or if Leon simply assumed his genius overruled all. The audience fed off the friction, their reactions a tangle of cheers and jeers. Elon's fingers twitched against the chair, his poise thinning as he shot back with hard truths about melting ice caps and drowning coasts. Crisis Stephen Unk's jabs couldn't fix, but the host wasn't after answers, he was after blood. By the segment's end, the divide was stark. Stephen had framed Elon as a rogue visionary tinkering with the Earth like a toy, while Elon's terse replies hinted at a simmering resentment. The applause swung Stephen Unk's way, his zingers hitting their mark, but Elon's silence grew heavier, his gaze slicing through the host's swagger. The commercial break beckoned a brief reprieve, but the atmosphere thrummed with unresolved heat. How much could Elon swallow before he struck back? And when he did, who'd be left standing? The stage was set for a reckoning. The studio lights snapped back on as the late show returned from its break, the audience settling into a hum of expectation. Stephen Colbert reclined behind his desk, writing the high of his earlier jabs. His smirk suggested he'd already won the night. Elon Musk sat across from him, his posture rigid, the faint twitch in his jaw betraying the storm brewing beneath his calm. The geoengineering debate still hung in the air, a live wire. Neither man was ready to let go of what had been a sparring match before now felt like the prelude to a brawl. Stephen wasted no time diving back in with a barbed quip about Elon's drones turning the sky into a billionaire's canvas. He leaned forward, eyes glinting, pressing the guest on the human cost. Farmers blindsided by shifting weather, communities left to choke on the fallout of untested tech. His tone dripped with accusation, framing Elon as a man too detached to care about the lives he'd disrupt. The crowd lapped it up, their laughter and claps fueling Stephen's momentum as he painted a vivid, grim picture of a world remade in Elon's image. Elon's response came slower this time, his voice low but cutting, slicing through the host's theatrics. He countered with cold precision, highlighting the millions already suffering from floods and heat waves, crises ignored by critics who'd rather mock than act. His words carried a weight that silenced some of the cheers, but Stephen brushed it off, pivoting to a personal dig. He questioned if Elon's obsession with grand fixes stemmed from a need to be seen as a savior, a messiah complex dressed up in solar panels. The jab landed, the audience erupted, emboldened. Stephen pushed further, his confidence swelled as he began to pace the stage. Gesturing wildly, his voice rising to a crescendo, he challenged Elon to name one community he'd consulted, one voice from the ground he'd actually heard before launching his plan. The question hung there sharp and taunting. For a moment, Elon's eyes narrowed, his fingers curled into a fist. He started to answer, citing a coalition of scientists and engineers, but Stephen cut him off mid-sentence, spinning to the crowd with a flourish, dismissing the response as more elitist noise. The interruption stung Elon's face, hardened, a flicker of something dangerous crossing his features. The segment barreled toward its peak. Stephen, now fully in control, his every word a hammer strike aimed at Elon's armor. He circled back to the idea of accountability, asking who'd pay when the skies turned against them, who'd clean up the mess when Elon's gamble failed. The audience was his chorus, their reactions amplifying his dominance. But beneath the noise, Elon's silence grew deafening, his stare locked onto Stephen Unblinking, as if measuring the man across from him, the host, caught in his own rhythm, didn't see the shift. Not yet. The stage vibrated with the promise of a breaking point, the air thick with the unspoken. Elon's restraint was fraying, and when it snapped it wouldn't be quiet. The studio air crackled as the late show barreled forward, the audience, now a live wire of anticipation, feeding off Stephen Colbert's relentless assault behind his desk. Stephen was a conductor of chaos, his gestures sharp, his voice booming with a mix of mockery and righteous fury. Elon Musk sat opposite, a coiled spring masquerading as stillness. His face was a mask of control that barely held. The geoengineering clash had morphed into something uglier, a personal vendetta. Stephen seemed determined to win, oblivious to the fault lines he was prying open. Stephen ramped up the attack, his sarcasm thicker, now questioning Elon's motives with a venom that felt rehearsed. Yet raw, he spun a tale of a man so enamored with his own brilliance that he'd risked the planet just to prove a point. His words were punctuated by exaggerated shrugs and knowing glances to the crowd. The audience roared, swept up in the spectacle, as he accused Elon of hiding behind numbers and tech, too cowardly to face the human wreckage his drones might leave behind. It was a performance, and Stephen was its star, basking in the glow of their approval. Elon's rebuttal grew terser, his voice a blade cutting through the noise. He pointed to the decades of inaction that had left the world teetering, the governments and pundits who'd failed while he at least tried. His logic was airtight, his passion seeping through the cracks of his restraint. But Stephen wouldn't yield. The stage, the host pounced on every pause, twisting Elon's words into sound bites for the crowd to jeer. His interruptions relentless, he mocked Elon's intensity, suggesting it was all a show, a tantrum from a man who couldn't handle being questioned. The laughter swelled, and Elon's knuckles whitened against the armrest. The tipping point loomed, and then Stephen crossed a line. He leaned in, close voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, asking if Elon's real plan was to abandon Earth once he'd broken it off to Mars with his riches, while the rest burned. The accusation was absurd, a cheap shot, but the crowd ate it up, their cheers drowning out Elon's attempt to respond. Stephen straightened, arms wide, soaking in the noise. His triumph felt absolute. He didn't see Elon's eyes darkened, didn't catch the way his breath steadied, as if a decision had been made. The host had misjudged his prey, mistaking silence for surrender. The segment teetered on the edge. Stephen launched into a final flourish, demanding Elon admit he'd never cared about the people, only the glory. The words hung there, a gauntlet thrown, and for a heartbeat the studio held its breath. Elon's head tilted slightly, his gaze locked onto Stephen's with a predator's focus. The audience didn't notice, too caught in the host's orbit, but the crew did. Stage hands exchanged glances, sensing the air turn electric. Stephen, drunk on his own momentum, grinned wider, unaware he just handed Elon the match to burn it all down. The studio vibrated with tension, so thick it seemed to hum beneath the lights of the late show. Stephen Colbert stood at the helm, chest puffed, his latest barb about Elon's supposed apathy still echoing through the applause, but Elon remained rooted, his silence no longer passive but loaded, a cannon primed to fire. A hush rippled through the crowd, not from reverence but confusion. Elon Musk leaned forward, slow and deliberate, elbows resting on his knees. The overhead lights painted shadows across his face, sharpening every angle, making him look less like a guest and more like a reckoning. Stephen Colbert, still riding the high of his crescendo, didn't see the shift. He cracked another line, something smug about ego and rockets, and the audience dutifully laughed. But this time the sound didn't carry it. Bounced off Elon's silence like static on glass. Then Elon spoke. "You think this is a joke?" he said, calm, steady, but laced with an undercurrent so cold it cut through the heat of the studio. "You think words win wars, you think applause fixes a melting world." The laughter died. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably, as if they'd stumbled into something they weren't supposed to see. Stephen opened his mouth to respond, but Elon didn't give him the chance. "You mock innovation because it scares you, you wrap it in punchlines. So you don't have to face your own irrelevance. You don't want solutions, you want a villain. Because if there's a villain, you don't have to admit how little you've done." His voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. It carried the weight of someone who'd built empires and burned through storms of criticism before breakfast. It was the voice of a man who'd stopped asking for permission. Stephen laughed, a little too loud, a little too forced. "So now you're the hero in your own dystopia." But Elon's eyes didn't flinch. "No, I'm the one cleaning up after cowards who only talk." The studio crackled with something darker. Now the audience was unsure whether to cheer or recoil. The air was heavy with friction, like two tectonic plates grinding underfoot. And then Stephen made his fatal mistake. He stood, theatrics as always, arms outstretched, voice booming, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. "Well, maybe if your tech was half as effective as your ego, we wouldn't need this conversation at all." He motioned to the crew for the next segment, trying to pivot, trying to escape. But Elon didn't move. He just stared, ice in his veins. Stephen stepped around his desk, approaching Elon with mock bravado. "Come on, Elon, you really think you're the answer To the world's problems, Elon stood. The audience gasped. He towered over Stephen, not just in height, but in presence. The mask of civility had cracked. His voice dropped an octave, barely above a whisper, but sharper than any shout. I think I'm the only one in this room who's trying silence. Stephen tried to shrug it off, but his swagger faltered. The crowd was no longer laughing. The energy had turned. And then Elon stepped forward, not aggressive, not violent, just final. The way a door closes, the way a storm arrives. Stephen instinctively backed away, a beat too slow, a moment too late. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the balance shifted. The alpha of the room suddenly, undeniably, someone else. Then Elon turned to the audience, not the cameras, not the host, just the people. Mock me all you want, but when the oceans rise and the crops fail, you'll remember this moment, when the world laughed instead of listening. He walked off stage. No cue, no sign-off, just a void. In his wake, Stephen stood there, hand half raised, unsure whether to spin it into a joke or call for security. But the moment was gone. The narrative had slipped through his fingers. The camera crew froze, waiting for direction. The audience buzzed in disbelief, some clapping awkwardly, others just staring at the now empty chair. Stephen tried to recover, forced a grin, cracked a line about Elon's dramatic exit. But it fell flat. The storm had passed and taken the oxygen with it behind the curtain. Elon didn't look back, and on that stage, for the first time in a long time, Stephen Colbert was left not with applause, but with silence.